1:05.
1:05. See, we're perfect with our consistent with our 1 p.m.-ish. So thank you, everybody.
There we
And
go.
thrilled that you're here. And I really want to really thank Dr. Tony Smith. We had talked about doing a science. We will actually, so as most of you might know, we tend to do this in the library. We've done this the past year, these a speaker series, and spring just seemed to bring a lot of people from the STEM field. So we were going to be almost having a science spring. And not to be deterred, Dr. Smith reached out to me earlier this week, or late last week, wasn't it, Tony? Saying we can do this virtually. And, you know, I was really excited that some other folks had contacted me and said, hey, can we keep this up and do it virtually? And I was like, well, and then here we have speakers, and, you know, I've already reached out to a few other people and are willing to share their great experiences and knowledge with us. So, so Dr. Tony Smith, most of you probably know, he is our, you know, physics and astronomy instructor. His undergraduate and and make sure if I get this right, Tony, I don't have it in front of me. You're from Yakima Central, and you've got your PhD at Washington State University, and you've taught at CWU and WSU, and now of course you're teaching with us. And Tony's also the faculty advisor for our Student Science Club, and they are a pretty active group. I love seeing them walk down the hallways on campus, you know, with whatever apparatus they have on cards, but they're on a mission and very passionate about the club.
Our new telescopes, yeah.
Telescopes, okay, which is really was great to see. So, so thanks Tony for kicking this off, and everyone, I appreciate you being here. And I will monitor the chat if you have questions. But again, if that seems to be a barrier for you asking the questions you want to ask, just go ahead and chime in. We're pretty informal, so thank you all.
Okay. One small correction to the introduction. My PhD was actually from WSU. I did my undergrad work at Central. My grad work was at WSU.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I thought I said that right. So, thank you for correcting.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and get started with the talk here. So this is one I originally gave for a planetarium show back at Central Washington University last summer, and it coincided almost exactly with the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. I think I gave it about 2 days before the actual anniversary, and we're still on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions, because there were a series of them from 1969 to 1972. There were 6 total that landed on the moon. Apollos 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Apollo 13 was the one that experienced the emergency when they had an oxygen canister explode on the way to the moon, and they had to basically turn the lunar module into a lifeboat and swing around the moon and come back. And actually at the end of this, I have a link to a Smithsonian chat that they did with Jim Lovell, the commander of that mission, where they're actually interviewing him about the whole affair. But yeah, we're still on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo program. NASA has a whole Apollo 50 program for the public going on right now, reaching out to educational institutions and the public in general. And in fact, just last week was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. Last Friday to the day was the anniversary of their splashdown at about 10 o'clock in the morning. So most of these pictures I took from the Smithsonian Institution when I was there for a talk, well, not a talk at the Smithsonian, but a talk in DC for a conference a couple summers ago. And the first thing you see when you walk in the door is this great big mural. Actually, the funny thing is the first thing you see is, since this is a cultural thing and not something to deal with actual air or space, I'm kind of surprised they had this in the lobby, but the first thing you see when you walk in is the original model of the Starship Enterprise from the original Star Trek, which I would argue that should probably be in one of the cultural museums, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, this is a mural that you see of the moon landing. This is supposed to be Neil Armstrong planting the first American flag on the moon, and then over to the side they've got a lunar lander and the Earth up in the sky and so on. And kind of the one thing that's maybe a little bit unrealistic about this picture is that the background of it looks a little bit bluish, but the moon is very airless. There is no sort of air or water on there to refract any sort of light in the sky. So you don't see a blue sky on the moon. It's just completely black. You just see black with the star backgrounds. And in fact, if the sun is out, it's so bright that it bleaches out the stars. So you basically just don't see anything. All right, so I had a video to start this out, but Jackie and I were trying to get it to play, and we couldn't get it to play that well, but it was Walter Cronkite kind of narrating the first moon landing, and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, they landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong took the first steps off of the landing pad, and he said that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And actually, he kind of fumbled a bit with his words. He was supposed to say one small step for a man, but he accidentally left out the A. All right, so, oh, video's starting to play. Yeah, we tried playing it, but unfortunately the sound doesn't play over. Okay, how do we do the next slide there? There we go. So the space race kicked off in 1957, and it ultimately culminated with the Apollo moon landings. But the start of it was the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union. And this is not the actual Sputnik. That one orbited the Earth a few times and then burned up in the atmosphere. But this is a mock-up that they have in the Air and Space Museum. And the way the museum is designed is that they've got a bunch of rooms off to the side, but then the central part of it are a couple open air atria where they've got stuff hanging down from the ceiling. And this is one thing that they happen to have hanging down from the ceiling. This is the mock-up of Sputnik, and it's not very big. It's maybe about the size of a basketball, but it orbited around the Earth and it sent radio signals down that people could pick up. And the Soviets were kind of masters of propaganda with this, because they made sure that the orbit carried it over the most densely populated areas of the Earth, especially the United States, because they wanted to make sure that the United States knew that they'd beaten us into space. And then the next step that they took, this is not actually a picture from the Smithsonian, this is from a Russian museum, but this is the capsule that Yuri Gagarin rode into space. He was the first man that was sent into space in, I believe it was either 59 or 60, might have been 61 though. And it's not very big. He basically just rode up on a rocket and then parachuted back down in this capsule right here. And there's really only enough room for a person to sit in, because it wasn't meant to be in space for that long. Oh, interestingly enough, the image of the Russian flag or the Soviet flag that I have, the first search that popped up for that, the image that I used was actually eBay. So I have to note the ultimate irony that the communist flag I found on the ultimate capitalist website. Well, then the American response was to send some astronauts into space. The first was Alan Shepard, and he went up very briefly and then came back down after about an hour. And then there was the Friendship 7 mission, and this was the first American mission to orbit the Earth. This was John Glenn's capsule. And this is the actual capsule in the Smithsonian. This is in the open air atrium right there behind some glass. And this is actually as small as it looks. This part right here was basically just where he would sit during the mission for the couple hours that he was up there orbiting around the Earth. He would basically just be sitting in a space about as big as your easy chair and just pushing buttons and looking out the window. So this was not the sort of job if you were a person that really didn't like cramped quarters or you needed to move around. This was sort of, to borrow a phrase from modern times, this was sort of the ultimate social distancing. So actually, interestingly enough, I just noticed this. I don't know why I didn't notice this before, but in the reflection of the glass behind there, you can see this is the nose cone of a plane, and these are two wings coming off. This is actually Chuck Yeager's X-1 plane, the one where he first broke the sound barrier. then the Soviets started sending up a number of spacecraft of their own that were multi-person, because the next step after sending up one person is you want to send up a couple different people. You want to be able to run some long-term missions in space. And this was a Soyuz capsule. Now, the Soyuz capsules that the Soviet Union launched were very versatile. In fact, the design was so robust that they're still using them to launch people up to the International Space Station and back. And the rocket would attach back here, launches it up into space. This is kind of the docking or service module right here for connecting to another spacecraft. And then this acorn looking thing right here, this is the re-entry capsule.
How long does it take me? I'm not in the chat, but I'm just gonna ask, how long does that take? Because I have to admit, I'm claustrophobic and this terrifies me just looking at this. But how long would it take? You're saying they're using a similar model now to send people up to the space station. How long are people actually in that capsule too during that journey? Do you know? If you don't know, that's fine. I'm just.
Well, to go up to the space station and back, actually not super long. So getting out of Earth's atmosphere is pretty quick. Space is only like 60 miles up. So if you launch a rocket straight up, you're above the main part of the atmosphere very quickly. What does take a while is that while you're in orbit, then you have to link up with the space station, and it's basically like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet. You have to line it up, exactly right. So they have to orbit around several times, try to get a visual on the station, and then dock. But we have really good tracking of them by radar, so they're not really doing it blind. They know where they're going, but it takes a few hours. It takes a few hours, and the Apollo missions specifically, people would be in an enclosed space in the capsule for like a week. So yeah, we'll definitely get to that. And this is actually one of the Soyuz reentry capsules. They're a bit of a dime a dozen because there's been just so many Soyuz missions. And you can see, well, you can't really see too well in this photo, but off to the side, the people who recovered it actually wrote their names on the side, so it had a little bit of graffiti on it. But you can see that the outer layers got stripped off in reentry, and it's just kind of the bare bones of what's left. Our response was to send up a two-person craft, and this was supposed to be sort of a stopgap between the Mercury missions, which were just one astronaut, and the Apollo missions, which were going to be three. And so the Gemini missions were two-person craft that got sent up, and they would orbit around the Earth for about a week. And again, these are about as small as they look, and two people would be in this space for a period of a week. And it was actually, there weren't really a lot of question marks on the technical stuff. They mainly were just worried that two people wouldn't be able to be confined to that space for a period of a week and not end up just at each other's throats by the end of it.
My stomach is churning at the thought. I'm just
yeah. I mean, imagine for those of you who are spending the quarantine with like a significant other or roommate, imagine you're stuck in a small room with them for the next week and you can't leave or do anything else. So that's what they were in for. But NASA selected their astronauts psychologically very well, and they just treated it like any other mission, and they were fine by the end of it. Okay. So the Apollo 1 fire was this really tragic event in 1967, and what happened was, in the build-up to Apollo, they were trying to test a lot of stuff out at once, and to save some time, they made the mistake of trying to do an electrical test the same time as a pressurization test. What they did was they had astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee in an Apollo capsule, and they'd super pressurized it with 2 or 3 atmospheres worth of oxygen. And they also were doing some electrical tests. Well, unfortunately, one of the side effects of electrical tests is that you get some sparks. And if you get sparks inside a super pressurized atmosphere of oxygen, well, those of you who know welding or anything to deal with pressurized gas, that's a recipe for disaster. And sure enough, what happened was fire like ripped through the capsule and just killed them instantly. And they are actually buried in the Arlington National Cemetery, since they were both war veterans or military veterans, and as astronauts, they counted as sort of people who died in combat. Then they were actually allowed burial at Arlington Cemetery. But the Apollo missions went on, and we corrected the problems that we had, and eventually we got up to the point where we built the Saturn V rockets, and these were actually still to date the largest rockets that have been built, because you're trying to send a rather large payload above the Earth's atmosphere, so you're going to need this to lift it up. But then the problem is, to lift up the weight of this stage 3 right here, you need the fuel from stage 2, and then to lift up stage 2 above the atmosphere, you need the fuel from stage 1 down here. So basically, all of this right here is just to get this little teeny cylindrical part up at the top above the atmosphere and going to the moon. And in fact, this stage 1 right here was jettisoned after just the first lower 10 miles of Earth's atmosphere. That was actually just to get them above the densest part of the Earth's atmosphere. And then the stage 2 actually got them into orbit. And then stage 3, they pointed toward the moon, and that shot them off in the right direction. And to the right here, this is a model of the N1, which was the rocket that the Soviets were planning for a similar mission to send people to the moon. But after we'd beaten them to the moon, they actually just decided that there was really no point to it, so they abandoned that completely and decided to concentrate on Soyuz missions in orbit and building a space station. Okay. And actually, in the background for all this, there are all these display cases that I took pictures of a lot of them, but I don't really have time to go over every single one of them. But this is, we will actually see this in a moment. This was a suit that was worn on the moon. And these plaques right here talk all about the history of the space program, both from the American side and the Russian side. So this is the size of a Saturn V's engine. So that model that we saw, those engines down at the bottom of it, this is how big they are in real life. This is taken from the bottom of one of the stage 1s of a Saturn V rocket that wasn't ultimately used to send anyone to the moon. But we can see just how large that they are. Here's some people down here for scale. And in fact, all of the fuel comes through this little nozzle right here. Okay. So this is the part that the astronauts would actually live in. And this is the command and service module. So they actually have, on the other side of this, there's an umbilical connecting it to that Soyuz capsule I just showed you. And that is a mock-up of, after the moon missions were done in 1974, we actually did sort of a joint friendship mission with the Soviet Union, where we sent up an Apollo capsule, they sent up a Soyuz capsule, and they actually docked with each other for several days. And this is the Apollo service module. This is what held all of their water tanks, oxygen tanks, their batteries, fuel, everything that they needed to keep things running. And then over here, this cone-shaped thing, that was what the astronauts lived in. That's the command module. And that was actually the only part of the spacecraft that returns to Earth, because what happens is you go land on the moon, you lose the lunar module, and then part of the lunar module will come back and dock with the spacecraft, and they transfer astronauts over, they jettison the lunar module, they head back to Earth in just this, and then they jettison this cylindrical service module right here, and they just return to Earth in this part. And I will actually show you the command module from Apollo 11 in a little bit. Okay. So this is Apollo 4 command module. This was one of the unmanned missions. There were not actually any astronauts in this. They just sent this up into orbit and back automatically to make sure that all the equipment worked. And this is hanging in the Apollo room at the Smithsonian. This is the instrument panel from a command module. They took one of the ones that wasn't really used, and they just took the instrument panel out of it. And boy, this is some cutting space age technology right here. All these switches and dials that for anybody who's used to modern day electronics, this probably doesn't seem that advanced, but it was pretty useful for the time, and it managed to get people to the moon and back. So it actually worked quite well. But boy, I'd hate to have to be the one who tried to remember what each one of these individual switches was. They had guides for that, but I'm sure that memorizing those was probably quite out of the question. So the first mission to orbit the moon was Apollo 8. And Apollo 8, this was the mission badge for it, and they named it Apollo 8 because, well, it was the 8th one that was in the line, but also just by coincidence it happened to do sort of a figure 8 around the moon, because the path you go is you go to the moon, you orbit around it, and then you come back like this. So they decided to incorporate the 8 as part of the badge. And in fact, you'll probably recognize this name in the middle here, Lovell. He was the lunar module pilot for Apollo 8. So for Apollos 8, 9, and 10, these were sort of dry runs for the landing on the moon. What they would do is they would actually take the lunar module, they would decouple it, and they would lower it down almost to the surface of the moon, about 80 nautical miles above the moon. And this was to make sure that the lunar module could just get down and then come back. Because the big question mark that they actually had wasn't so much how the spacecraft was going to function, because they tested that enough. But the one thing they really couldn't simulate at all was, how are we going to be able to take off from the moon? The biggest thing they were scared about was the lunar module getting stuck on the moon and not being able to return. And then, in fact, Nixon had a whole speech written up for what he would say to the public in case the Apollo 11 astronauts did not return. It was written by William Safire, his speechwriter, and it's actually considered one of the greatest speeches never given. But Jim Lovell, you'll probably recognize his name as the commander from Apollo 13. And he was one of the more senior astronauts. He actually, I think at the time, had flown more hours in space than anyone else had. But he also was a little bit unlucky. So he had basically 3 chances where he got close to landing on the moon in one way or the other, and none of the 3 were ones that were successful. So in Apollo 8, that was the first one that was sent to the moon. And so they decoupled the lunar module. They almost got down to the moon's surface, and then they came back. And he had noted several times that it was rather frustrating to be just 60 miles above the moon and not able to land. But he consoled himself by saying, you know, that's okay. On a later mission, I'll be able to land on the moon. I'll be able to walk on the moon. Well, he was the backup commander for Apollo 11. That was the one that was the first one to land on the moon. So if Neil Armstrong had actually gotten sick in the days leading up to the launch of that mission, Jim Lovell would have been able to step in and take over for him. So that would have been chance number 2 to walk on the moon. But luckily for the continuity of the Apollo 11 mission, Armstrong was perfectly healthy and they didn't need to replace him. And then the third was the Apollo 13 mission, where he was finally supposed to walk on the moon as the mission's commander, but then they experienced the problem with the oxygen canister in the service module exploding and wiping out a bunch of their machinery, and then they had to do an emergency plan to return to the Earth without landing on the moon. Interestingly enough, I was listening to the live chat from the Apollo 13 mission, and I was very impressed by how they managed to keep their cool during the whole thing. In the movie, they were quite excited during the whole thing, but if you actually listen to the live chat as it was going on, they were describing things very matter-of-factly. They were not panicking at all. And in fact, interestingly enough, they had a lot of camera equipment that was given to them to take pictures of the lunar surface. And since they weren't able to land on the moon, they said, well, we got to take pictures of something. So they basically just took a bunch of pictures of the Earth and a bunch of pictures of each other just to use up their film, just to kind of use it up for something. So it's probably actually the mission where the astronauts took the most pictures of each other. And as far as I know, none of those went on Instagram, though. But anyway, Apollo 8 was the first mission to actually be able to take a picture of the Earth from orbit around the moon. As they were doing their first orbit around the moon, the Earth came up just above the horizon, and Jim Lovell actually pulled out his camera and took this. And this has subsequently been called Earthrise. And it is the first view of the Earth from the moon. Okay. Jim Lovell himself, he was actually very experienced as a navigator. This is all the equipment that he would use back when he was in the Navy as a pilot in order to help navigate his aircraft. And this is kind of this is a star chart back here of, this would be, say, the position of the sun at a certain time of year, and maybe the position of the moon during the time of a mission. And these would be pieces of equipment that you would use for photography and figuring out your latitude and longitude and so forth. And you could also do that by observing the stars, seeing what angle that the stars made with the sky. Okay. Interestingly enough, in the Smithsonian live chat that they did with him a few days ago, I found out that originally he applied to be in the Air Force, but he failed their entry exam. And so he went into the Naval Academy instead, and the rest is history. Okay. This is the lunar lander. This is, well, not an actual lunar lander that went, to the moon, because those didn't return to the Earth, but this is a mock-up of one. This is one that wasn't used for any particular mission. And this is actually gold foil, and it's used because it's really, really good for blocking out sunlight and heat. And this part right here housed 2 astronauts, and there's a ladder here that you would use for climbing down. And this is a very spidery looking thing. It's not anywhere close to being aerodynamic, but there's no air on the moon, so that really doesn't matter. And then at the end of it, this top part of it would blast off from the moon, and you don't need a very powerful engine to do that because the moon's gravity is not that strong. And that would go into orbit, and it would dock with the rest of the Apollo craft and transfer them back over. And in fact, this is during the Apollo 13 mission. They were lucky enough to have everything on the lunar module still intact because they hadn't yet landed on the moon. So they were able to use all the supplies, the air and the water aboard the lunar module in order to act as sort of a lifeboat for the trip back. And they also managed to use the engine on the lunar module as a way of doing course correction, because the larger engine on the service module was most likely damaged in the explosion. And interestingly enough, if you look above the lunar lander right here, this is a plane hanging from the ceiling. That is actually Charles Lindbergh's plane. That is the actual Spirit of St. Louis, the one that he crossed the Atlantic in. And in the room right behind them there, there's not a picture of it in this talk, but behind them in that room there, that is actually where the Wright brothers' original plane is, like the first airplane that flew. So this lunar lander was also often called the LEM, or Lunar Excursion Module. And it was built actually by the Northrop Grumman Company, which still exists. They still do produce products for NASA and a number of other companies as well. So this is what it looked like inside the LEM. This is basically half of the space. What they did was they just took one of the LEMs and they cut it in half down the middle, and this is what you'd see. So there's some instrument panels here, some very limited windows, and then a bunch of bars to hold on to. And this is because when you land on the moon, now suddenly you're experiencing a little bit of gravity again, so you go from floating to having to stand up. So you have to have some bars to grab onto there. But yeah, for the Apollo 13 mission, 3 guys had to basically exist in a space twice this size for a time of about 4 days. Let's see. Oh, I think I'm getting some questions in chat here. Wonder if I can.
We're getting some fun comments where people are really kind of sharing some of their experiences. So Shira Hansen has had her picture taken with Jim Lovell, which was kind of a cool story.
Oh, nice, nice.
Yeah, I know.
Nice.
Yeah. So you can probably see it was a true honor, which I could certainly imagine.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Rachel commented that Borman, who you were mentioning earlier, he had, I guess, cattle ranch near Hysham, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Hysham, Montana, and their little local museum, she believes has some items that he donated, and which was neat. And
Nice.
Pete Van Dyke, Dr. Van Dyke recommended a book, which I will get for the library, called Lost Moon, in addition to the one Dr. Smith mentioned earlier in this talk. So.
Van Dyke is actually ahead of me because that was one of the sources I was going to actually list at the end of my talk.
Great, the great minds think alike. And
Yes.
yes, and Nadine, so this is another personal connection. Nadine, Nadine, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Stickline. I think her mom worked with Northrop Grumman, the company you just mentioned. So she's had a lot of experiences meeting pilots. So yeah, a lot of personal stories you're sharing, Tony. Cool.
Nice. Okay, great. So finally, the Apollo 11 mission was the first one to land on the moon. And this was the first of the Apollo missions where they decided that the mission itself was more important than the individual astronauts. So what they did was they didn't have their names on the badge. This was just a badge that said Apollo 11. And then this is the Eagle landing on the moon because, of course, their lunar module was called the Eagle. That was why right after they landed, Neil Armstrong said the Eagle has landed. And there was a whole really scary affair where it turned out that the spot on the moon that they picked for a landing was a lot rockier than they expected. So he had to maneuver down through a bunch of boulders and finally find a spot that was not super optimal to land because they were down to, there's a certain amount of fuel on the lunar module, and they were down to being about 2 or 3 seconds before having half of their fuel used up. Now, the problem with using up half your fuel is if you use up more than half your fuel, you can't get back. So if he'd waited another 2 seconds to land, they would not have been able to get back. And he basically just had to put it down in the least rocky spot he could find. And that was why after he said the Eagle has landed, Mission Control said, we copy you. You got a bunch of guys down here about to turn blue. We can breathe again. But this is Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. And Michael Collins is kind of less well known than the other two because he didn't actually get to land on the moon. He stayed behind with the command module because you need to have somebody in the command module to actually keep track of things while the other two are doing the landing. Buzz Aldrin is actually very, very active on Facebook. He's got a Facebook page where he posts quite a bit of things, and during quarantine he's been still very active. Michael Collins as well. He's kind of more soft-spoken, but he's kind of known as being a really good writer, and he is also a bit of an artist. I think he's painted some paintings of space and such. But yeah, both Aldrin and Collins are still alive. Neil Armstrong, I believe, passed away in 2012, a few years ago. But yes, they're landing on the moon here, and this olive branch is supposed to be a symbol of peace because according to the plaque, they came in peace for all mankind. So this is the actual Apollo 11 command module that returned to Earth. Now, I didn't get to see this one originally in the Smithsonian because for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission, this was actually out on tour. And I lucked out because it turned out that last summer, it was on tour in Seattle. It was at the Boeing Museum of Flight. So kind of the last weekend it was available to see, I went and took a peek there. And actually, if you get a chance to go to the Boeing Museum of Flight and you've never been there, it is a great place because they don't just have displays like this. They also have a whole room for like World War I aviation and like the Lafayette Escadrille. And they have a hangar off to a side building where they have all these gigantic planes parked where you can actually go in and take a look through them. You can look through a 747. You can look through one of the new, I want to say it's Dreamliner, one of the new Dreamliners. You can look through a Concorde, and they actually even have one of the original Air Force Ones there. They have the Air Force One that was used by Eisenhower, Nixon, Johnson, and Kennedy. It was, I believe, actually the one that Nixon used to fly to China to do the meeting where they opened up trade with China. And interestingly enough, if you walk through that plane, it's obvious that the president was not meant to be there for a long period of time, because it's basically just the presidential suite is a bed and then a desk with a small telephone and a small bathroom off to the side. So that's basically it. But yeah, the Apollo 11 command module, this was called Columbia, and it was named this for a couple of reasons. For one, that was actually back when, due to the fact that the history around him is not so great. Christopher Columbus is no longer highly regarded anymore, but back then he was considered sort of the epitome of exploration. So a lot of the time, Columbia would also be used as a synonym for the United States, or like the North American continent. So they thought, oh, that's symbolic of exploration in America. And also, which is more important, in Jules Verne's book, From the Earth to the Moon, that he published in the late 1800s, that was about a gigantic cannon that shot a projectile all the way to the moon for astronauts to go there. In that book, the name of the module was the Columbia. So this is actually sort of a case of life imitating art. But anyway, this was the only part of the Apollo spacecraft to return to Earth. And this is just kind of the bare bones of what's left of it. This is the jack that connected to the lunar module when the mission was going on. And this is the opening hatch. What they did was they actually removed the hatch and replaced it with plexiglass. So if you get up sort of close, you can look inside and see the control panels in there and such. And this is not very big. It's only 12 feet wide, and from top to bottom, it's about 10 feet tall. And that was space that had to do for 3 astronauts for a whole week. So yeah, that was still very, very cramped quarters. And so they had all these things in a room out in the Boeing Museum of Flight down in Tukwila. I went through and took a bunch of pictures. I haven't included like anywhere near as many of the pictures that I've taken in the talk. There's a ton more interesting stuff I could talk about, but I've kind of winnowed it down to the most important stuff. And this is actually the hatch that they took off. This is the outside of it, and you've got kind of a handle for grabbing it, and this is for instrumentation. And then this is the inside of it. This is this really complex locking mechanism for being able to hold it in place. And the thing is, you want to be able to hold it in place very, very securely, because, well, you don't want any sort of cracks to develop in that seal while you're in space. And there's just this kind of little window to look out through. And that door was only opened twice during the mission. One was right before launch to let the astronauts in, and the second time was right after splashdown to let the astronauts out. It was completely sealed for the entire rest of the time. The only time that you would otherwise be able to open it is if you wanted to do an extravehicular activity, where you would vent out the command module and then have somebody on an umbilical that would actually go out. But the Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 missions did not do any of that. This is the heat shield material. They had to come up with a very, very light but strong set of materials in order to protect the spacecraft upon re-entry. And this is a honeycomb of metal that's filled with various layers of epoxy and such. And they actually show like the various layers that are put on there. And this is the heat shield at the bottom of it down here. And you can see it's definitely been burned up on re-entry, but it's still intact in terms of being there. There's some little cracks in it, but it's a material that's very much meant to bend but not break. So it's light enough but still strong enough to survive re-entry. And you can see some little pittings there where little particles of dust and such have hit it during the re-entry. And then this is interesting right here. When I originally saw this, I thought it was going to be some sort of control jets or something a little more grand than it was, but actually these are just waste vents. So basically when they went to the bathroom in the spacecraft, this is where it vented out. And we have 2 vents here, and they're pointing in opposite directions, and that's actually because you don't want to vent going in the same direction too much, because what will happen is that you'll actually get the spacecraft spinning the opposite direction. Those of you if there's any of the physics people from Central watching, or my students from my physics class, that is conservation of angular momentum right there. So these are the gloves and the helmet that were worn by Buzz Aldrin during the mission. And these are meant to be gloves that are very flexible, but still very strong. You want them to be able to be vacuum sealed, so the vacuum outside doesn't really interfere with the atmosphere inside. And this is gold tinted because that was the best thing to protect from very, very intense sunlight. So out in space and on the moon, there is no atmosphere to protect you from the intense rays of the sun like we have on the Earth. The sunlight just comes in like directly. So you have to have some very strong shielding on that visor to protect your face from the sun. And that's why in every photo of an astronaut on the moon, they've got this gold sun visor down and you can't see their face. These are star charts. These, you can't really see the details on them, but this is the background of stars, and then these 6 circles right here correspond to 6 possible views that you could get from looking out of the lunar module window. And this was used to help orient the spacecraft as it was descending to the moon. You could line it up with a particular star and know that you were exactly where you needed to be. This is a sample box for moon rocks. What they would do is they would load moon rocks in here and then take them back onto the lunar module and then transfer them over to the command module with the astronauts for return to Earth. And we'll actually see toward the end of this a few of the moon rocks. And interestingly enough, since there's no atmosphere on the moon, that means when things get hot in sunlight, they get hot really quick. When things get cold, they get cold really quick. And so on one of the Apollo missions, they had rocks that they had sitting in the shadow of the lunar module for just like a minute or two, and then they took them into the spacecraft. And when they were unpacking things, when they repressurized it and they were about to launch, one of them made the mistake of trying to touch it with his bare hands, and it was so cold, it was still something like negative 100 degrees, and it almost gave him frostbite. This was a survival kit, so this is actually interesting. This was so the astronauts could survive if instead of landing in water, they happened to land on a tropical island in the middle of the Pacific and had to survive for a couple days in the jungle. And this was like a large knife to cut your way through the vegetation. There's some rope, some sun goggles, and some medicine and such, and canteen for water, and any other supplies they might need. Okay. A little closer to home, this is the TV guide cover that was actually painted by Norman Adams, and he was an artist that was originally from Walla Walla. Interestingly enough, this is not from the Smithsonian. This is not from the Boeing Museum of Flight. This is actually right here in town in the Fort Walla Walla Museum. So he was an artist that left town to go work back east. He painted a lot of covers for TV Guide, and he was tapped to do the TV Guide cover for the first moon landing. And that was back when, if you wanted to know what was going to be on TV in a particular week, what you would do was when you were in the checkout line at the grocery store, you'd grab a copy of TV Guide. And that would tell you over the week, like, oh, well, this is going to be on this channel on this particular day. And of course, this was going to be the event that everybody was going to be watching on July 20th. So they made sure that this was on the cover of it. And they wanted to have the picture be as realistic as possible. So they let Norman Adams talk them into letting him take home one of their cameras. So this, to the lower right side of the painting right here, that's a camera that was used to film the moon landing. And at the time, there were only 2 of them. One was kept by NASA. The other one was already being loaded up on the Apollo 11 mission to go to the moon. So each one of these was worth about $1 million a piece. Norman took one home with him. And there's a rather humorous episode where apparently his stepson didn't realize that it wasn't a regular camera and tried to film some stuff with it and almost dropped it. But the camera was none the worse for wear. And he painted it. NASA was worried about it either being damaged or somehow getting into the hands of the Russians so that they could figure out what sort of filming technology we had. And so they were calling him like every hour on the hour and asking, is our camera still safe? Is it okay? When do you think you're going to be done? And if you've ever worked a project with a deadline where you have somebody breathing over your shoulder asking every half an hour, hey, are you going to be done yet? Do you think it might be done? Hey, could you wrap this up real quick? You know how frustrating that is. Okay. So this is back to the Smithsonian artifact. This is, so on the spacesuit that you'd wear to walk on the moon, this was actually the interior part of it. This was supposed to be more to fit the form of a human body. This right here that looks like a gas mask, this was actually to hook up to the oxygen tanks in the backpack. And in fact, you can see, if you look closely, this says E. Aldrin. That is Edwin Buzz Aldrin. This was actually the suit that he wore on the moon, or the inner part of the spacesuit that he wore on the moon. Okay. And this is the outer part that would be worn over that. This was worn by the astronaut Scott during the Apollo 15 moon landing. And actually, your camera is not deceiving you. The bottom of this is very dirty because that is still a lot of dust from the moon. The moon is extremely dusty because there's no water to keep any sort of the soil kind of down. So if you walk on it, there's just all these dust particles. They're flying up all over the place. So those would stick just by static electricity to the suit. And instead of cleaning them off, they decided, oh, well, we'll just kind of keep it as it is. And we can see all the, we can see all the little nozzles right here. This is where various tubes were supposed to hook up to for life support apparatus, for gas exchange and so forth. And this was a Soviet lunar suit that they designed, which, of course, it was never used to land on the moon because the Soviets didn't land anybody on the moon. But this is sort of what it would look like, not super different from the American version. And this is, I would hope that this is just to keep this particular model of the suit upright and not because they actually expected somebody to walk along the moon with this sort of walker right here. I can't imagine that that would be very, very gainly on the surface of the moon. In the Apollo room for the Smithsonian, these are some of the objects that were actually taken up into space by Apollo 13. These are, or sorry, Apollo 11. These are ones that were actually brought back in the command module when they landed. And there are various things like toothpaste and a toothbrush and a razor. And this is very difficult to do hygiene when you're in space because you are in a situation with weightlessness. So you're just kind of floating around. So the problem is, you brush your teeth, you have to make sure none of it gets out of your mouth and is flying around the capsule. In fact, if you're shaving, the problem with shaving is all the little teeny hairs will come off and float around the capsule, and some of them will float in the middle of electrical circuits and short them out. So you got to be really, really careful that you're like vacuuming your face as you're shaving. And this actually right down here is called the fecal bag. And yes, this is the bag that they pooped in before they expelled that out of the spacecraft. And this is a urine transfer tube. This is basically what they peed in before it was jettisoned out of the spacecraft through those nozzles that I showed you on the Apollo 11 command module. So yeah, space travel was not completely glorious. There were many, many mundane things they still had to do along the way. And this is a copy of the plaque that we left on the moon from the first landing. This was actually kind of curled up and put on the leg of the lander, and then it was uncurled and placed on the moon. And it was signed by Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin, and Richard Nixon, who was the president of the United States at the time. And actually, he was the president for all of the Apollo missions, so he is the only president of the United States that has his name on the moon. And he also holds the record for longest phone call because right after the moon landing, he called Neil and Buzz from the Oval Office, actually right after they were planting the flag, to congratulate them and wish them the best. And he originally had a whole like 30-minute speech to read, but then NASA told him that, we have kind of limited time on this, so we have to sort of hurry through things. So just keep it to the bare minimum. And it says here, from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD, we came in peace for all mankind. And we didn't just take artifact back from the moon, we actually left some there. So this is a mirror that Apollo 11 left on the moon. And this is to reflect light that's sent from the Earth. Specifically, we've gotten to the point where we've reflected a lot of laser beams off the moon. In fact, down at the Caltech labs in Pasadena, what they do is they actually have a giant laser that they will shine on the moon at the spot where this particular mirror is, and it's strong enough that it actually bounces some of that laser light back to the Earth. And from the timing difference between when it's emitted and when it comes back, they can actually determine the distance to the moon very precisely. And they figured out that the moon is actually receding from the Earth at a distance of about 4 centimeters or so per year, which is not very much, but over millions or billions of years, that really adds up. And in fact, our current theory for the origin of the moon is that the moon was originally part of the Earth, but then there was a very large impact that blew off some material into space that coalesced, and it's been kind of receding since. Okay, we also left a flag on the moon. Now, unfortunately, the flags we left on the moon are not still recognizable as American flags, because what happens is that very intense sunlight, because there's no air on the moon, will make pigments in fabric break apart very, very quickly. If you leave anything that's colored in terms of fabric out in very, very intense sunlight for a very long period of time, what will happen is it breaks the dye down, and eventually you lose all the dye in that, and it just ends up white. So the flags that we left on the moon have now been bleached by sunlight to be completely white. So I guess if anyone comes along, if any aliens come along and find it in future generations, they're going to think we were like surrendering to the moon or something. But yeah. And then there's actually a couple of them, like the first one from Apollo 11, they unfortunately erected it a little too close to the lunar module. And so when the lunar module took off, the exhaust that was blowing out debris from that actually knocked the flag over. Okay. So I mentioned quite a bit about Apollo 13. If you've seen the movie, you remember that Gene Kranz, who was played by Ed Harris in the movie, he had a tradition of wearing a new vest that his wife sewed for every individual mission. And this was kind of the plain one that he wore for Apollo 13. And this is actually the vest. They have it actually on display in the Smithsonian. This is a lunar rover, also known as a moon buggy, and this was used by Apollos 15, 16, and 17. They managed to store it up underneath the legs of the lunar lander, and they could take it off and they could kind of drive around the moon with it and go a lot farther than they otherwise would. And these were left on the moon. They were not actually returned to Earth, but I believe there was a satellite photo of the moon that was in enough detail that it actually managed to capture like the tracks from it 50 years later. And here's some of the rocks we brought back. This is a sample of basalt from Apollo 15. So here in eastern Washington, basalt makes up almost all the bedrock. And this is the same general type of rock on the surface of the moon. It's very black colored. It has a lot of bubbles in it for when it first formed. And the rock solidifies, and those air bubbles that were in it just kind of also stay in place as well. And then there's anorthosite, which is a little bit more coarser grained lunar rock. And they have it set up so that these are suspended in the middle of this mirror cavity right here. And so off the sides, you can see the reflections from the rock, and it makes it really easy for viewing. There's also a place where you can actually reach in and touch the moon rock, but I wasn't able to find where that was. It was supposed to be down on the lower levels of it, but I couldn't really find that. This is breccia. This is very coarse-grained rock that was taken back by Apollo 17, and that was actually the last of the missions that landed on the moon. And then finally, some soil samples. So these is soil from the moon, and they would scoop up some of it, and then they kind of gently put some of the soil samples out on this plate here to stick. Okay. So the final closing thoughts, where do we go from here? Now, this is from my favorite webcomic author, Randall Munroe. He was at one time a computer programmer for NASA, and he's very trained in physics and astronomy. And so he'll do a webcomic about space, about physics, about math, about programming. And a lot of the time he'll also look at numbers. And what he did in this one is back in about 2010, 2011, he actually did a projection of the number of Apollo astronauts who would still be alive at later days. And what he did is he figured from kind of standard actuarial tables. These are tables that insurance adjusters use to figure out things like how long people are going to live. Said, you know, this is the likely range of the number of living astronauts we're going to have. And at the time there were 10. We've unfortunately had a few pass away since then, but he estimated that on average, we're probably likely to not have any of the astronauts who've walked on the moon left alive by 2030. And in each one of his comics, he has a rollover text, which if you put your mouse over it, it'll actually show you what it says. And his views on it are, the universe is probably littered with the one planet graves of cultures which made the sensible economic decision that there is no good reason to go into space, each discovered, studied, and remembered by the ones who made the irrational decision. So, in closing, I'd like to thank the library of CWU and Walla Walla Community College. If you want more information on the Apollo missions, you can go to them. And also, there were a number of really good TV specials as well. American Experience had Chasing the Moon last summer. That's still available to watch from PBS. Apollo has this, or NASA has this great program called Apollo in Real Time, where you can actually go in and listen to the broadcasts from the Apollo missions, and the entire 7 days is just saved up as like 7 days of audio, and you can go in and just pick certain times of it. You can go back and watch the first moon landing like as it happened, and for each one of the 50th anniversaries of the individual missions, they will actually do like a live 50 years later version of it. So they just did one last week for Apollo 13. And if you're curious about that Facebook live chat with the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum that I talked about with Jim Lovell, this is actually the link for it right here. It was recorded last Thursday, and it was with Jim Lovell, and also, I forgot her name off the top of my head, but she was the curator of the Apollo artifacts at the Smithsonian. And then the books Lost Moon by Jim Lovell, Failure is Not an Option by Gene Kranz. And finally, I'd like to thank the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, the Boeing Museum of Flight, the American Association of Physics Teachers, that's the meeting that I was originally in DC to attend, the Escala program that funded me attending that conference, and also the Walla Walla Community College Library, the CWU Library, and the sources that I got the flag pictures from. And here is actually the full mural right here. This is supposed to be an astronaut standing next to a moon buggy. This is the lunar lander, and this is the Earth. And then this is the other side of it. This is various planets with Saturn right there. All right. So thank you. Thank you all for coming to listen to my talk. And now I have a few minutes. I can take questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's.
Let's see, I didn't see any questions coming up in the chat.
A good idea, a good place to.
But people had amazing stories of they're either, I met an astronaut here, such as like story must have been Grant County, Oregon, which is really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I think the whole county has like 8,000 people. But as you see it coming up in the chat, there's a lot of great thank yous, Tony, for your talk.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think somebody is asking if this recording will be available for later viewing.
Yes, I'm sorry. That did come up in the chat, and yes, it will be. So.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful. Yes.
Yeah. I was
Yes.
finishing my bachelor's and then starting my master's degree. Yeah. Awesome.
Do you believe the first picture you, oh, somebody asked, do you believe the first picture you showed us was not actually taken in space? Well, which picture was that?
I bet it was the mural picture. That's like usually the conspiracy theory picture. Like, did that flag actually, because
Oh, well,
some of the conspiracy theories, there's wind blowing, there should be no wind on the moon and that sort of thing.
oh, well,
That's what I'm
it
guessing.
wasn't blowing from the wind. It was going back and forth because what happened was as Neil Armstrong was planting the flag, the lunar soil, you had to kind of get the flag down in the soil, so you got to kind of jimmy it around a bit to make that work. And on top of that, there have been, quite a number of photographic experts that have looked at the video and said, well, yeah, this looks like video that was, taken under the conditions on the moon. And on top of that, the
basic design is
the Apollo missions to the moon, it would have actually been harder to fake them than it would to have done them actually, because the way that it actually worked is that when you're in orbit around the Earth, you have to communicate back to Earth, and you're going around a lot faster than you would be if you're on the moon. So, people on the ground were actually able to monitor Apollo's chat in real time, and they could see that they were moving as if they were on the moon. So yeah, plus the number of people that were involved in the mission was so large that if it had not been real, you would not possibly be able to have kept them all quiet for that amount of time, for 50 years, and not had anyone come forward. As Benjamin Franklin once said, the only way for 3 people to keep a secret is if 2 of them are dead. And so with 100,000 people, I'm not sure how you'd even be able to do that at all. Okay, so let's see. I'm not seeing any other questions here.
Yeah,
if anybody wants to unmute their microphones, they can ask probably.
Humanity deniers and conspiracy theory.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Surprising.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing actually a few names that I don't recognize from the college here. I wonder if those are students at Central, maybe.
Maybe you have an expanding fan club. So.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've given plenty of talks at Central, so a number of the students there have seen me talk. Well, if any of you are actually listening from Central or from off the Walla Walla campus, go ahead and message me in the chat.
Oh, and someone did just ask, Tony, they had the opportunity to go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum too last summer, and would have loved to have spent more time there. And he was curious about what your favorite exhibit was.
Yeah. I really liked as far as exhibits go, I really loved all the Apollo stuff, but it's kind of hard to pick a favorite because they also have a room of the Wright brothers' original plane. And there's actually a really cool one where they have a lot of the planes from the early days of air travel, like some of the original mail planes. They have one of Amelia Earhart's planes there, not obviously the one that she disappeared in because that one was never found, but they have some old Pan Am planes from old transcontinental flights. And they have all of these setups also with uniforms for flight attendants back in the 19th, and how, interestingly enough, the big name actors and celebrities in Hollywood would often have to sign clauses in their contract that they would not fly because it was considered so dangerous at the time. Their studios were so worried that they'd die in a plane crash. So sometimes there would be agreements that they'd have to sign that said, I won't I won't fly on an airplane for the 5 years that I'm under contract for this and such. And yeah, the Smithsonian is huge. And the great thing about it is it's free. The Smithsonian is 100% free for entrance. And in fact, all of these Smithsonian buildings are. The big three that we usually think of for the Smithsonian are the Air and Space Museum, which is the one that I went in and I saw just about everything in. And actually, that's one of only two. I didn't see the other one, which is they have a giant hangar at this facility called Udvar-Hazy down near Dulles Airport. And I was kind of in a hurry getting to and from the airport for the trip, so I didn't get to see that one. But they have a whole space shuttle there. They have actually the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan there. And they have, I believe, Concorde there as well, and some other very large stuff. That's where they store everything that's too big to fit in the smaller main building for the Air and Space Museum. And then the other two big ones they have are the Museum of Natural History and the Museum of American History. Those two I have not seen yet, but yeah.
Those are the two I spent my time at when I
they
lived
also have
there.
a bunch of art galleries. Yeah. You could spend a whole day there and not see everything, definitely. And that's one thing I loved about DC is that even though food and lodging in the city is quite expensive, just about all the tourist attractions are free. And in fact, American Association of Physics Teachers is supposed to meet again in DC next, well, the summer after this coming one, the summer of 2021. So hopefully I'll be able to get to see even more next time.
Drawing is the thing I've had down the most. I've got to
Okay,
work
well,
out the
if there are any more questions, or people could probably contact you
for
later if they had
the
questions. Tony, are you okay with that? If you,
Yeah, sure.
I thought you would say
Sure.
yes. So I volunteer
Yeah.
you. Great.
Yeah.
So thanks. I want to say thanks again to everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And Tony, you're going to give a talk
It
May
was
8th, right?
really fun. I love giving this talk, and I'm sure you all loved hearing it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, and just to let you all know, Tony agreed to give a talk on May 8th. So that'll be our Science Friday, our next Science Friday on exoplanets, which ties in perfectly with May the 4th be with you week. So we'll.
That's right. That's right. I'm going to be giving a talk that I've given a number of times. I've given it at Central for planetarium shows, and I've given it at my classes here for astronomy at the end of each quarter. And it's about various alien worlds in works of science fiction. And I talk about how realistic they are or not. And the second half of the talk is exoplanets. I actually talk about real life planets outside of our Star Wars week, because it's very heavy. The first half of it in Star Wars, I talk about a lot of the planets from Star Wars.
Then after that, May 15th, everyone who's interested in our Science Fridays, Dr. Logan Higgins is going to be giving a talk May 15th. And so that'll be our Science Friday on May 15th. So she's either going to talk about viruses of the gut microbiome. I'm not sure which it'll be very fascinating either way. So looking forward to that. But you'll see the email reminders come out. So I hope you can all join us.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks again, Tony. Thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate it.
Well, yeah, you're welcome, and thank you again to everyone who attended. I will see you again on May 8th.